Yes, there are two different notions you need to bear in mind. First of all, there's what you called how the funds, you spoke about how the funds are going to be distributed. So there are formula with various different criteria which are going to serve as a basis in order to calculate how we can allocate the funds that are going to be given to member states through certain programs. What I wanted to say was that what we're doing is we're adopting the documents individually. Some of the Commission's proposals have been adopted. They were adopted yesterday. So those are subject to the press conference, and the documents were sent on to the Council with the various different formulae there. In some cases there were figures, and in some cases there weren't. Now, on the basis of this formula, in some cases calculations were made. This is the case for the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And for others, the calculation will only be done later on. That's the case, for example, for REACT-EU. We'll be able to make available the formula, the estimations as well, but only in those cases whereby official estimates have been carried out. So we'll give you that as soon as possible. In some cases, the information was already sent on to you, and so you should have already received what is officially available. But you need to understand that there is some data that will only be officially available later on, once the calculations have been carried out on the basis of updated data. That's especially the case for REACT-EU and everything that links in to bolstering rural development. When it comes to projections on national contributions, I'm going to have to look at the figures. I don't actually have them to hand, but I will come back to you on that, David. Any other questions on subjects pertaining to Next Generation EU or the MFF? Now, we've obviously had a number of press conferences on these subjects, and they should have elucidated you. Athanasios.
Is it on this issue?
Well, it's remotely linked to this issue. It's on the general Next Generation EU plan, and more specifically, I would like to repeat my question, which I raised earlier with the Vice President, the Commissioner Vestager. I don't remember. Sorry about that. And it's on the vouchers issue. So, are you planning, or do you have any means to force the airlines to reimburse the customers who bought tickets and they were offered vouchers if the airlines receive any kind of assistance from any kind of stream of the Next Generation EU budget? Either this is the facility for liquidity or any other part. That's the first thing. And secondly, are you aware that there is a new kind of scam perpetuated by the airlines right now as we speak? They offer flights that are not really existing. They accept your money, and right after they change the flight schedule in a matter of 5 to 10 minutes, leaving you with no opportunity other than asking for a voucher or accepting the flight plan change, which is a scam by itself. So do you have an answer on those two things? Thanks.
Thank you, Athanasios. You rightly described your first question as being very, very remotely related to Next Generation EU. We are discussing a proposal which was made on Wednesday for an instrument of 750 billion euros to reinforce the European budget. The first thing is that this proposal has to be discussed with the European Council and with the European Parliament. And therefore, I think it's way too early to start operationalizing some of the elements like the one that you have just described. And your second question is not at all related to this. So, like I said to David just before, we will come to the issue of vouchers in a second stage. But I'd like to finalize the discussion on the Next Generation EU. So, I would like to know whether Lorenzo. I would like to ask all of you to only keep your hand raised, Lorenzo, Stefan, Oliver, Mose, if those questions are related to Next Generation EU, the proposals from Wednesday. If not, to unraise your hand, but it seems to be the case, so we move to Lorenzo. Je t'en prie, Lorenzo. Press speak.
Go ahead, Lorenzo.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Now, do you hear me? Yes, it's about Next Generation EU. It's a follow-up to David's question. We really need to understand more clearly what's been approved, what hasn't been approved. You told us that what was approved concerned the Resilience and Recovery Facility, but not REACT-EU. Now, since Wednesday, we've had a table showing pre-allocated funding for Next Generation EU. It's even been published as concerns the grants. It was published in Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung yesterday, I think. And here we have all the figures concerning grants and loans with the totals. Has this table already been approved? Does it represent the allocations that have been approved by the Commission? Then there's another table on page 51 of the Commission staff working document, and here there are different figures. So what's the relationship between these two tables? That's what I'd like to understand, because I've been here for 35 years, and I've never seen so many documents all arrive at the same time. In 2-3 days, we've received so much that we have to try to read and understand. So could you clear some of that up? Yes, Lorenzo, that's a very pertinent question. I think that the information that's been distributed concerned figures that were made available internally for the purpose of unofficial projections, just to facilitate internal discussions. However, once again, these figures concern or contain figures that are final figures or definite figures, amounts under the Recovery and Resilience Facility on the one hand, and also as part of the Joint Transition Fund on the other. There are also projections which are only for internal use at the moment. They're preliminary calculations, particularly as concerns REACT-EU and rural development. If you look at the legal proposals, I think it's specified that these figures will be established more officially at a later date in the autumn on the basis of information available then. We have already made available some official figures for the two programs I've mentioned, Recovery and Resilience Facility and DTF on the other. If there are any additional figures that have been circulated, they don't come from official European Commission documents at this point. Although, of course, internally, for the purposes of discussions in the college and the services, some informal figures have been advanced. I understand your position completely, because I've worked a great deal in this area myself in the past. As soon as you start talking about figures in the MFF, you run into the problem that there are two different calculation methods. There's the one using current prices and the one using constant prices. Because you've been around for more than 30 years, I'm sure that you've already been faced with this difficulty. Current prices, actual prices, are nominal values year after year that give you a total. Constant prices are based on 1 year, and I think within the framework of discussions on Next Generation EU, I think the year chosen was 2018. These are amounts to which a deflator is applied, and this brings the nominal value of 2007 up to its value for 2018. So it gives you an idea of amounts that will be dispersed later. And this was why it can be a bit difficult to find your way through all these figures, to find exact figures. It's not that one is correct and the other isn't. Both of them are correct, but they result of a different approach to the situation. It all depends on the subject of the discussion. So I think that this is the explanation for the differences that you've seen. In addition to the fact that in some tables, for the purposes of internal discussion, there have been the inclusion of some figures for REACT-EU and rural development, and in some other documents not, because these figures haven't yet been transmitted to the other institutions. But we're going to try to put all this into a global format, and perhaps this will make everything clearer. I agree. With more than 2,000 pages of documents, it's a bit difficult. It's even difficult for us here. So now I'll move on to Stefan Israel. I think is on the same subject.
Oui, c'est sur le fonds de recouvrement.
On the recovery fund, Fonds de Relance, are you going to ask EFTA or the EEA countries to make any contribution either now or at a later stage? I don't know whether you were able to ask that, Stefan, at the press conference which took place yesterday on that very subject, but we will be getting back to you on that subject. Balázs.
An answer to that question, sorry.
Yes, hi. So in terms of this particular question, I can tell you that the funding of the RRF will be provided on the basis of grants and loans. The total amount of grants available under this facility will be 310 billion euro, while an additional 250 billion will be available in terms of loans. I could add possibly that regarding the grants, a maximum amount per member state will be determined based on a predefined allocation key, and this allocation key will be particularly beneficial to countries with a lower per capita income and with high unemployment rate, to reflect the high economic and social challenges that these countries face. Now, in addition to the grants, of course...
Balázs, sorry to I'm not sure that you heard the question from Stefan. He had a very specific question related to possible funding through countries such as Switzerland of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. But I think that is really a specific question which we will need to come back to unless you have the elements at your disposal. Because
indeed, I will come back.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Oliver Grimm, welcome back.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Hi. Super. So are you going to, or when are you going to provide us with a simple table of where the 500 billion euros go to which member states in 2018 prices. That's everything we ask for. We just need a simple table with the 27 and the 500 billion, just showing which part of those 500 billion is going to which member state in 2018 prices. When are you going to give us that? And just an additional question on the now famous or infamous internal document that we all got and that we all reported upon. Are you aware that the figures there don't add up to 500 billion? It's, I think, about 405. Is that because the document was drawn up at an earlier stage when you were thinking about maybe a smaller total amount? Or are there some 95, 100 billion that went somewhere else and that were not accounted for? Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver, because this allows me to clarify a common misunderstanding related to the 500 billion in grants that we're talking about. The 500 billions are only partially pre-allocated to member states. You will remember that the Next Generation EU is composed of three main pillars, which have been described in quite some detail by President von der Leyen, or indeed before that in the technical briefing which we had organized here. You have a first pillar which reinforces, which will provide funding to member states, in particular through the Recovery and Resilience Facility and through REACT-EU and the GTF. But you also have two other pillars, which are not meant specifically for the member states, but, for example, the second pillar will help provide funding to companies, businesses, wherever they are in Europe. And, in fact, you just had a press conference before this midday briefing. In fact, you had two press conferences which described this pillar, the Solvency Instrument and the InvestEU and Strategic Investment Facility. Now, the some 30 billion euros which make up these two instruments together, they are not pre-allocated to member states. And then you have a third pillar, which is composed of reinforcements to specific EU programs, such as Horizon. Now, clearly, the ultimate beneficiaries of those programs will, in most instances, be in member states, sometimes also in neighboring countries or in the rest of the world, but mainly in EU member states. But those amounts are also not pre-allocated to member states. And therefore, you can trust me, there was no mistake made in the table when it comes, we did not give you, you did not see information related to funding from earlier drafts. It is simply the fact that out of the 500 billion in grants, some is pre-allocated to the member states, some goes to programs or to instruments such as Solvency that will fund companies. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, as I've said, we will only be able to give you an official table of pre-allocated amounts to member states for those programs where those calculations have officially been made and transmitted to the other institutions. So they will not include the amounts related to REACT-EU and to rural development, because those figures will only come at a later stage. Apologies, it was a bit detailed, but I think it's necessary for us to be on the same analytical footing. Mose, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. In fact, I have two questions about the second and third pillar. But first, if I may, a small clarification about the first pillar, about the figures. It was not clear to me when we talk about the ratio between loans and grants, whether the interest on the loans will have to be paid by the member states, by the beneficiaries, or whether they will be paid by the EU budget. That's a clarification. And when it comes to the second pillar, I noticed that there will be a big increase, about 15 billion to the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development. I didn't have the opportunity to ask any questions to the commissioners or vice president on that, but they talked a lot about the do not harm principle and about achieving, let's say, the targets of the biodiversity and farm to fork strategies. So then my question is whether there is any objectives, let's say, to decrease the support to the production of meat in agriculture in Europe because of its impacts on both climate change and also public health. And the second question that is about the third pillar, about this new health program, which I understand has been, let's say, taken out as a stand-alone program now from the European Social Fund, and will also be increased to 9.4 billion. And then my question is very simple, that is whether the Commission has, let's say, identified a need for any treaty changes to better feel to enforce its role in preventing, let's say, future pandemics. Thank you.
On the third question, nice try, Mose, is all I can say. That's not a question on the health program, that's a question on treaty change. Now, what we are proposing is a health program within the existing treaty framework. Obviously, as we have said, and as indeed Vice President Skinas said here yesterday, we are looking forward to the debates in the context of the Conference on the Future of Europe to look at all issues and hear the voices from citizens on all issues related to the management of the crisis and what this could mean in terms of roles of all of the institutions, member states, etc., that are involved. But for the moment, the health program is obviously clearly based on the existing legal basis. On your question related to interest payments, my understanding is that obviously the EU is going to go on the market and raise funds on the capital markets. It will do so with its AAA rating, and that, of course, will imply the reimbursement of interest payments, and these would be done through the EU budget, through the annual budgets, over the course of the next multi-annual financial frameworks. As far as interests are concerned, from the next multi-annual financial framework, as far as capital is concerned, only as of 2028. So indirectly, obviously, we will, when I say we, EU institutions and member states, will have to repay those interests to the capital markets, which is why we have also made proposals for the raising of new own resources that would help us cover those interest costs related to the loans which will have been taken. On the do not harm principle, I would like to pass the floor to Vivian.
Thank you. Moses, as you correctly pointed out, the Next Generation EU does have as its principle when it comes to green funding that all the funding done under the Next Generation EU should be carried by the idea of this do no harm, do follow the principles that we've put in place in the European Green Deal, in our environment policies, climate policies, and so on. So this will apply to the whole of this Next Generation EU financing.
Thank you very much. David from Politico, is your question on this issue as well?
Yes. Hi, Eric.
Hi, David.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
So we've had roughly 48 hours to digest this grand package. And I wonder if you could help me with something that I can't quite understand, sort of contradictory messages we've heard. On the one hand, this is portrayed as a near Hamiltonian moment, a threshold moment for how the EU does business. And at the same time, the president, when she spoke, was very clear that this is a one-off, an emergency response. And I wonder, in your mind, and having sat through all these meetings, because you've obviously been briefed to answer all of our questions, what's your sense of it? Which is it? Is it a fundamental change in the way the EU does business? Or is this a one-off emergency response so that if and when the next emergency happens, anytime within the next 30 years, if that's the term of repayment on this, it will limit the EU's ability to respond? And a related one, just going back at one of the core benefits here, which is that this debt as it's carried wouldn't be on the debt load of the EU member states. I mean, at some point, wouldn't you expect that the ratings agencies wise up and realize that indeed the EU member countries have obligations, not just nationally, but to the Union as well? But if you could start with the sort of broader philosophical question, I'd appreciate it.
Well, we introduced poetry into the press room. I'm not sure we're going to introduce philosophy into the press room, David. And in fact, you answered your question yourself. Obviously, I can only reiterate what the president of the Commission said. It is not the president of the Commission that has said that this is a near Hamiltonian moment. She has clearly said that this is a one-off to deal with the crisis at hand. And she has been very explicit on the fact that the crisis that we are facing requires that we move forward together. She said this very eloquently in her speech in the European Parliament, and that as far as she was concerned, it was either everybody reacting on their own to this crisis, 27 little hearts, as I think the speech said, or moving forward with one big heart. And this is exactly what this response is about. So it is a proposal to deal with the current crisis. We then will have to see, based on the conference on the future of Europe, what are the discussions related to the roles of and the responsibilities of the EU much more generally. So that's on your first question, and I must admit I have completely forgotten your second question. Could you repeat? Sorry, it's a Friday afternoon blues.
Isn't in the end, the debt obligation a debt obligation, whether it's done collectively? I mean, at some point, the financial markets are smart and they wise up and they realize that if you owe money as an individually or you owe money together, you owe money. It's very difficult for me to get into the minds of rating agencies, and I would definitely not try. Therefore, it's not a question which we here can really answer. What I can say very, very clearly is that the European Union has a track record in terms of its performance on financial markets, which has led to this rating that it currently has and has enjoyed for a very long time, as far as I'm aware, and that the rating agencies and the markets understand that a body of member states and EU institutions like the EU, like the Commission and the EU in general, have significant means at their disposal in order to meet their financial obligations. And I don't see any reason for this to change in the near future. So just to follow up, would you say then that that the core funding mechanism here, it's unfair to refer to this as a gimmick?
I'm not going to get into debates, David, as to the way of describing our funding mechanisms. We have made a very serious proposal, a very political proposal related to the introduction of new own resources. It's very ambitious, so it is definitely something that should be taken very, very seriously.
Thank you.